I'm joined by Anshel Pfeffer, the Jewish Chronicle special correspondent in Israel, and I would say the foremost British journalist in the country. He writes for Haaretz, Economist, The Times, and others, and written a seminal biography of Benjamin Netanyahu. He joins me on Tuesday, the 31st of October, the 24th day of the war. Anshel, welcome. Thank you for joining us. If we can start with the latest developments in Gaza overnight and yesterday, the piece of news that's really made it across to Britain and around the world is the rescue of the hostage Ori Megiddish. Can you tell us what we know about that and what you think it means for the war?
I don't know anything about how Ori Megiddish was rescued because it was a secret mission, and the details of that, quite rightly, aren't being released. All we know is that this was an operation carried out by special forces of the IDF and a tactical unit of the Shin Bet. Beyond that, those are the details. And perhaps at some point after this war, we'll know more.
Did it come to you as a surprise that she was released? Or
no,
rescued?
I don't think that this is a surprising operation. People are comparing the situation to things that happened in the past when Gilad Shalit was captured by now. I think we're talking about 17 years ago. He was one Israeli soldier being held by Hamas in Gaza. There was a whole apparatus prepared for his concealment, and I think that throughout the 5 years that he was held there, his location wasn't known to Israeli intelligence, and that shouldn't be surprising. Hamas are no fools. They know that they have some serious capabilities themselves, and when it came to guarding and concealing one POW in Gaza, they could do that. Now we're talking about around 240. Now, of those 240, not all of them, as we know, are alive. They include also bodies, but there is a large number now of hostages being held in Gaza. Most probably being held by Hamas. Not only, we know that through the breaches in the border fence after Hamas attacked on October 7 came also members of Islamic Jihad and other small groups, even crime gangs and various privateers. Some of them who seem to have also succeeded in capturing Israelis, whether live Israelis or bodies. So there is now a relatively large number of hostages in Gaza. The situation in Gaza currently is quite chaotic because of Israel's ground attack and before that, the air offensive. And I think that the capabilities of whoever's holding hostage right now to conceal them and to ensure that the Israeli special forces won't be able to locate and release them is nowhere near what it was in the Shalit case. So it's obviously it wasn't a simple thing to send in special forces to get Ori Megiddish out, but I don't think it's a surprising development.
Is from as I understand it, Hamas's confidence has been very high since this extraordinary, repulsive massacre on October the 7th. Do you think this will have knocked their confidence and their standing in their supporters?
I have no idea of their confidence. Maybe you have sources in Hamas. I don't. So I don't know what their confidence is right now.
Avi Issacharoff was talking about that on a recent podcast, saying that as far as he knew, their confidence, or his analysis was that their confidence would have been boosted by the operation on the 7th of October. I mean, I just wondered whether you felt that the rescue of this hostage would be a real blow for Hamas, or whether it would be shrugged off.
Well, Avi Issacharoff is what was a very talented and well-connected correspondent for Arab affairs, so I'm sure he knows what he's talking about. Hamas is a big organization. There are different units. We saw just, I think, part of Hamas on October, and we're seeing now other levels of confidence. I bet and stuff like that I really don't know about.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's move on to looking at the Israeli political picture at the moment. I mean, as we all know, politics were very, very fraught before this war, and this has thrown entirely upended the board, as it were, of politics. What's the picture at the moment in terms of Israeli politics domestically? How people, what are the main fissures, dividing lines, issues? What's animating the Israeli public at the moment?
Well, the Israeli public, and obviously you can't generalize, but we have already seen a number of surveys and polls in the last couple of weeks, are basically feeling abandoned by the government there. Certainly those living in the areas impacted by Hamas attacks, and also the attacks are taking place up north from Hezbollah. We're talking right now about roughly a couple of 100,000 Israelis who have had to leave their homes. And you have hundreds of families of, probably thousands by now, families of Israelis who have been killed, wounded, and taken hostage. So there's a very, very big circle of people impacted by this. And everything I've been hearing, and I think you can see it in almost every interview on social media as well, is a very wide feeling of abandonment by the government. Families who waited for over a week to be even notified that their loved ones were being held in Gaza. No real coordinated effort for civilian relief for all those people who have had to leave their homes and are now living in hotels and kibbutz guest houses and with family, and obviously tens of thousands of businesses impacted. I mean, this is war, and there is war is not just about moving soldiers around and sending fighter jets on missions. War is about preparing a society, a civilian society, for what it has to go through. And in Britain, even though very few people actually have a living memory, that all the myths of rationing and evacuation, all the stuff that had to happen in the Second World War, where actually Britain wasn't even invaded on the ground, but there was the Blitz and other aerial attacks. A society at war needs organization. And right now, most of the organization is coming either from local authorities who are really struggling to hold up, or from volunteer groups, and Israeli civilian society has really come together here. But the government has so far totally failed. Just yesterday, they finally got around to appointing a task force leader for the whole civilian coordination effort. This is 3.5 weeks after this happened, and the man they appointed is some guy that nobody in the civil service has ever heard of. Some appointment for whose previous job was running local cultural centers. And this is the level of the response from the Netanyahu government. The man who in Israeli civil service, the Director General of the Prime Minister's office is the man who's supposed to, in times of emergency, to coordinate various civil efforts of the government departments. This is a man called Yossi Shelley. He is the one who should be taking care now of all those families who are uprooted. But what we've seen is that his job is to take care of one Israeli family, and that's the Netanyahu family. So that's what the Prime Minister's office has been focused on for the last 10 months, ever since Netanyahu returned to power. And you see that when a government has been dysfunctional in times of peace and is riddled with corruption, then when the war comes, they're not equipped to deal with this. And this is a very widespread feeling among Israelis, including many Israelis who voted less than a year ago for parties in this who support this government. We've seen already in the polls Likud losing 40% of its votes since the beginning of the war. And there's really very little good you can say about any of the civilian effort. And it's not just the organization. I think that at times of war, a leader needs to be able to direct the war, needs to be able to do two other very crucial things. They need to be able to organize the civilian effort. We just talked about how inept and pathetic that's been so far. And the leader also needs to be able to offer a sense of empathy and solidarity, which will keep the nation together. And so far, Netanyahu has not just failed to do that, he's actually spent his time blaming others in his now infamous and deleted tweet from a couple of nights ago. And I
that was when he blamed the IDF.
Sorry,
in that tweet,
he blamed the military intelligence and the Shin Bet, which they certainly have a massive part of responsibility for the intelligence failure, which failed to prevent the Hamas attack. But well, we can go into what Netanyahu's responsibility is there, but to attack them on social media at wartime, I really don't know what he was. I mean, I do kind of know what he was thinking, but it really is. It's really astonishing.
And what about this national unity government that apparently has been installed in Israel? What difference has that made, and is that really what it seems to be from the outside?
It's very hard to say at this point what the inclusion of Benny Gantz's party has achieved. I mean, first of all, it's not the main opposition party. is a much larger opposition party than Gantz's party. So it's hard, I wouldn't even call this a national unity government. This is a slightly expanded government with one party, which was until the war began, and then a few days later, because it took convincing Netanyahu to finally let them in. What they've achieved so far it's hard to say. We know, they have a member. Benny Gantz is now a member of the war cabinet. Another senior member of his party, Gadi Eisenkot, who's probably one of the most responsible and serious chiefs of staff the IDF has had in living memory. He's now also a member, but he's an observer member. So of the 5 members of the war cabinet, 2 of them are now Gantz and Eisenkot. It's hard to point at something that they've achieved. People in the IDF who are briefing cabinet and working with cabinet said to me that at least now there are 3 members of the cabinet who have relevant experience, including Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who was a major general. So for them, there's been some kind of reassurance, but at the same time, you hear from them a lot of despair about the way the cabinet is working. One veteran general who's been briefing cabinet called it to me a traumatic experience, and they're not getting from the cabinet and from Netanyahu a very clear idea of some kind of strategic planning. And this leaves the IDF general staff in a situation where it needs to do most of the strategic planning itself, while this is something that should be coming from the government, should be coming from the political level, and a lot of this they're simply not getting.
Mm. And in terms of the Palestinians on the West Bank and the Israeli Arabs, what has the response been to October the 7th, and how's that playing out as you see it?
So the level of violence in the West Bank hasn't really risen from the Palestinian side. The Palestinian Authority has tried to clamp down from their perspective. What Hamas did wasn't just an attack on Israelis. For their perspective, from the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority, this is a challenge to their leadership of the Palestinian people. So they've been clamping down. What we're seeing in the West Bank right now is a spree of violence from the settlers. Settlers have gone around shooting Palestinians in many places. We've had in 3.5 weeks over 300 deaths of Palestinians. Some of them were Palestinian terrorists trying to carry out attacks, but the majority, from what we've been able to see, are ordinary Palestinian civilians shot dead by settlers. The settlers are trying to really provoke another war in the West Bank. They think that will be something that will somehow help them get rid of some of the Palestinians there. I mean, I've spoken to IDF officers who are really shocked by what's happening, that at the time when Israel's fighting on Gaza, expecting at any moment another front to open up with Hezbollah in the north, you've got a group of Jews running around with weapons and shooting at people, trying to start a third war in the West Bank. And it's really hard to describe how irresponsible and how stupid that is, but that's what's happening.
And what's the IDF response been to that?
With Arab Israelis, I think that, I mean, there was obviously a lot of people were worried of some kind of rerun of what happened in May 21, when there were riots in some of the mixed cities. And so far, there's been no sign of that whatsoever. If anything, a lot of Arab Israelis have been in total solidarity, and they're part of society. As Benny Gantz put out yesterday a video to Arab Israelis saying, we're all together in this. This is something that should have come from the prime minister. It's sad that they had to wait 3.5 weeks for this to happen. And Gantz is now a minister, but he's not the prime minister yet. Netanyahu hasn't done any of that. But there is a feeling of a lot of solidarity. Around at least 20 Arab Israeli citizens were also murdered by Hamas in the attack. A number were taken prisoner as well. And there's yes, occasionally you do see some nasty stuff on social media, and there's also a bit of a witch hunt against that at the same time, which probably isn't helping too much. It certainly isn't helping that Netanyahu's national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, leader of the far right Jewish Power Party, has been a big show of handing out weapons in various places, and it's not that necessarily it's a bad thing that some civilian security groups should be holding weapons at a time like this, but the way he's been doing it has really been aimed at inflaming relations between Jewish and Arab Israelis. So far, luckily, the Arab-Israeli leadership has not risen and taken the bait. I think there's been a lot of very responsible statements from the Arab-Israeli politicians. Mansour Abbas put out a very strong statement yesterday condemning everything that Hamas has been doing and calling for Israeli solidarity. It would be nice to see some of the Jewish politicians doing the same.
Okay, thank you. Can you just explain a little bit to our listeners about the debate that's been going on over what might happen after the war in Gaza, assuming that Hamas is vanquished? What do you think that the planning and the debate is around what happens next?
Well, as I said before, there isn't really much strategic discussion happening in the cabinet, which is where it should be happening. And once again, I've heard complaints from senior IDF officers about that. There isn't really a discussion right now. Most Israelis are still focused on the traumatic attack of October 7 and of the immediate steps taking place now. Israelis, if those who haven't been called up themselves have children, brothers, sisters, parents, whatever, who have been called up, almost everybody is involved in this war effort and have a very immediate concern for their loved ones who are at the front. So I don't think the Israeli public right now is discussing that, but that is the kind of thing that should be discussed at the strategic, at the cabinet, the political level, because it's something that should have an impact on planning the next few steps. Even if we're talking about something that will probably only take place in a few months once the war objectives of destroying Hamas's military capabilities has been achieved. But it's not happening. It's not happening partly because this is a very dysfunctional government, which doesn't really have the capacity for long-term planning or any kind of planning. Partly it's not happening because the government's support base, the shrinking support base of this government, is increasingly far right, and the very idea that there'll be some kind of arrangement in which one assumes that because they're the only address for this is the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah will somehow return after 16 and a half years since the coup that took place in June 2007. That idea is anathema for the far right, and this government and this prime minister need the far right to stay in power. So even if there is talk in the government, then it's certainly very quiet. A few days ago, there was a report about some kind of discussion in government about the Palestinian Authority, and immediately Netanyahu's office put out a denial that there's no such talk. So it really is a lot of strategic blindness. There's no real, and certainly not at the cabinet level. And I know in the IDF that they've been forced to have some of these discussions and to put people in positions where this is being planned, because there's no one else planning it right now.
Now we're beginning to run out of time, but I do want to get your thoughts on the big issue really that's been so controversial in Britain and around the world, which is the issue of civilian casualties. What's the debate in Israel around civilian casualties in Gaza, both in terms of the public, but also in cabinet and in government? How much thought and consideration is being given to limiting those casualties, and what sort of different points of view are there at the moment? Well,
in the Israeli public, I don't think this is something that the public can currently really look at. This Israelis are focused in their own in the casualties they've taken and in the casualties they'll probably continue to be, both on the battlefield and as the rockets continue to land. So the Israeli public, with very small exceptions, obviously, there are Israeli human rights organizations who are trying to draw attention to this, but I don't think you can expect the broader public to have the bandwidth to really deal with that right now. in the government, there isn't much of a discussion. The IDF has its own mechanisms to try and limit as much as possible civilian casualties, and from what I'm seeing, those mechanisms are being used. But it's not a normal situation for any type of warfare where you have basically an army, because Hamas is built along the lines of a small army fighting from within its own civilian population. So these are the results of that type of warfare. And like I said, the army is focused on it. In the cabinet itself, it's mainly over what do we do with the American demand to allow in more supplies. And I think that right now, that's sort of the process that the Americans are saying, you need to allow in more trucks, and those trucks are going in through the Egyptian border anyway. And Israel kind of, okay, well, we don't want to take responsibility for the Palestinians, and we don't feel that right now that's our role. But if the Biden administration, who has really been admirable, there's only been really one government and one leader here in Israel in the last 3.5 weeks, and that's Joe Biden and his team, who have been incredible. And I think that the government are kind of saying, well, if the Americans are doing so much for us, we can't really say no to them on that. That's the level of the very not serious level of discussion about this in the cabinet.
And the demonstrations that we've seen in London and elsewhere, do you feel they're making any kind of impact on the way that the Israelis are thinking?
Yeah, the Israelis have enough to think about. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, Anshel, just a final thought on where you think the war might go next. What are your thoughts for the next few days, the next week? What do you think we can expect to see?
Well, the ground offensive has, I think, so far been not exactly as certainly was expected at the beginning, and not in the same way it was back in 2014 and 2009, the previous ground offensives, in the sense that these big simultaneous entrance of armored brigades and divisions from various directions into the Gaza Strip. What we see now is a much more gradual on-the-ground build-up, mainly encircling Gaza City and the suburbs around it. And night by night, more battalions are going in. And so far, we're talking now, it's Tuesday, so it's 3.5 days after the ground offensive began. The policy is a sort of fog of war policy. So, even Israelis who usually know this kind of thing find it hard to tell you exactly how many battalions are inside, exactly where they are. That's now the policy. We'll probably have a better idea in a couple of days of where things are. I think probably in a couple of days also reporters will be allowed in. But to predict how they're going to do it, but to be honest, I can't, and I think it's a good thing. I don't think that the next moves are ones that the IDF want to be predicted. I could spread out a number of scenarios here, but I'm not in the planning rooms of where it's being done, and so far they've been keeping it a secret quite effectively.
Understood. Well, Anshel, thank you for making time for us in this very stressful and difficult time. Our thoughts are with you and with the country. So good luck.